All right. Hello, all, and welcome to this seminar on nations, nationalism, and national conservatism. My name is Jonna, and I'll be chairing today's session. And for today's seminar, we are delighted to have with us Professor Craig Calhoun. Professor Craig Calhoun is University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University and Stanley Kelley Jr. Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching of Sociology at Princeton University. He was previously president and director of the London School of Economics, president of the Social Science Research Council, and of the Berggruen Institute, and variously a professor, dean, department chair, and institute director at UNC-Chapel Hill, Columbia, and NYU. He received his doctorate from Oxford University and has been a visiting professor in China, Eritrea, France, Germany, Norway, Sudan, and the UK. Calhoun's latest book is Degenerations of Democracy, which was published by Harvard in 2022 and was co-authored with Dilip, Gaonkar, and Charles Taylor. Professor Calhoun's talk will take around 30 to 40 minutes, and after that there will be enough time for your questions. So please note that this seminar will be recorded, so it would be great if you can switch your camera off and mute yourself unless you are talking during the Q&A session. So now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Calhoun.
Okay, thank you very much, Johanna. Thank you to the whole LUNN group for inviting me. My charge from Marco was to speak a bit about the course of my work and what I'm working on now and what's going on now. And I will try to do all of those things, but it's led me to create too many slides. So in order to keep in the time limit, I will be editing a little bit as we go on. But the question connected to some of my previous work is why nations matter now. Nations and nationalism, but nationalism and nations not the same thing. And for some time, I've argued that there is too much of there has been too much of a view that nations and nationalism can easily be superseded, that they are simply fading old forms of sociocultural and political organization, and that we can expect them to decline. When I first submitted an article on nationalism in 1992 at the request of the Annual Review of Sociology, which asked just for an article. That's what I sent them. They wrote back and said nationalism was not a big enough subject to deserve an entire article. If I would cover nationalism and ethnicity, this would then be enough to warrant pages in their journal. I did publish that, but I also think their response is indicative of people who study nationalism have known its importance, but to a considerable extent, mainstream social science treated it as, or didn't fail to treat it seriously. But clearly in the current world, there is a resurgence of nationalism, and I want to look at that, but I also want to situate that in relationship to nation, that is, to the national cohesion and solidarity that is challenged by our fears, by issues like migration, and by an undermining of common hopes. So we'll see if I can bring these things together and introduce you, if you don't already know them, to the national conservatives. So lots of nationalists today are right-wing populists, but there is a tendency to simply merge the categories. Right? We have a whole variety of leaders who are at once nationalist and making populist appeals, but these aren't quite the same thing. This misses the extent to which nationalism can be mobilized in different sorts of projects and can be a basis for democracy and Republican projects. The book that I published with colleagues a couple of years ago stressed the extent to which large-scale democracy has depended on national cohesion and solidarity, and is threatened by a variety of vectors of degeneration, one of which is new kinds of hyperpolarization, in which different segments of society not only disagree, but regard each other as not representing membership in the nation in a strong way. Nationalism has been, I think, a response as much as a challenge to these degenerations of democracy and to a variety of concerns. And the so-called national conservatives focus on many of these concerns. I won't have the time to go into detail about all of this, but there are notable themes that you should just keep in mind. For example, almost everywhere, this new politics of national conservatism has raised issues of sexuality, of simply gender, of homosexuality and gay politics, of transsexuality, threats to children, and raised them as threats to the future of the nation. And so integral to this kind of account is an issue that seems like it's not very much about nationalism, but becomes very integral and directly about the questions of nation and future as approached here. Similarly, perhaps above all, the issue of migration has been basic to the development of what we might call an internationale of nationalists that has a set of common issues that and common structures to this. Migration brings potential assimilation into countries, can be approached with ideas of solidarity, and indeed has been approached through solidarity. So for all of the extent to which issues of migration have been central to the problematic nationalisms of recent European history, there's an enormous European outpouring of solidarity, for example, in 2015. But this is challenged precisely as not being true to the nation by others who see immigrants overwhelmingly as threats. And I would add, it has been a problem that much of the what passes as the left in modern societies, which is often ultra-liberal rather than really left, has refused to think in terms of assimilation, and therefore has produced, if you will, weakly assimilated migrants who become targets of those who are defending the nation, rather than working to achieve national integration. On a whole variety of fronts, I think nationalism simply became associated with the right, and the idea of achieving national integration abandoned by the left with unfortunate results. So we get in the US version this attempt to build a wall with Mexico, which in some ways is laughable, but ought to bring us to tears, not laughter, and which is indicative of an imaginary construction of how the nation and its issues work. And it's not unique, of course. There are other walls. So what is nationalism? I've argued that it's an essentially contested question, that for all of us who study nationalism, there needs to be an acceptance that it's not easily pinned down. And when we make strong assertions, right, it is state-centered, it is ethno-symbolist, it is one or another thing, we miss the extent to which it is unstable and available for contestation. Right? So what is nationalism is not just a question that's hard to resolve, it's hard to avoid. Every potential resolution, in fact, is prejudicial to some values, to some projects that are being pursued. So nationalism, I've argued, is a discursive formation within which we have these fights. It is not simply one side of these fights in various ways. The different dimensions and variables that are important could be a much longer list, but include the questions of commitment to a durable cultural tradition that is allegedly manifest or not in ethnicity, and cohesive identities including those that are called political and civic identities. I'm not going to go in and rehearse what has been a long debate that everyone knows. What I want to suggest is that this issue has become basic to the national conservative movement in key ways. They have become claimants to the idea that there is a durable cultural, if not blood tradition in nations to strong ideas of peoplehood that have surprised many other observers. The issue of congruence with the state is a sensitive issue and problematic everywhere. The identification of self with nation, the at the bottom of the list, simply the aspiration to be stronger or to thrive in relation to other nations is there. There's a tendency to see nationalism, I think, overwhelmingly through its bellicose or competitive nature and miss the extent to which it is a set of internal claims on the others in the nation for being integrated into the nation on certain terms, that is, of what are regarded as legitimate sexualities or legitimate opinions in various areas. Not least, it is, I think, the ability to say we at large scale, in American terms, to say we the people, as our founding documents say. And I think we have become singularly unable to say we at large scale without meaning clearly to exclude others. Compare these two statements from prominent American politicians. The statement from Ronald Reagan just over 40 years ago makes the classic comparison of an ethnic and a civic nation. You can go live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. So we have a strong idea of naturalization. Interestingly, Ronald Reagan, for a long time the most popular conservative politician in America, is a bit out of fashion with the current MAGA Trump right wing, and partly for these reasons. He was articulating understandings of America that they now regard as weak, as having brought too much liberalism into the conservative movement. Here, J.D. Vance, by contrast, America is not just an idea. We are a particular place with a particular people and a particular set of beliefs and way of life. That's a homeland. It is, in short, a nation. Okay, so this is articulating a different view, close to what the literature has often called ethnic nation, but not simply in terms of ethnicity, in terms of peoplehood, and getting into how that is understood is a key theme in my current research on conservatives, and it's slightly different in different places. I won't be able to resolve all of this today, alas. I can just remind you, and I shouldn't think in LUNN and in this audience, I would need to do much more than remind you, that there are all of these things reproducing the idea of nation in ways that are familiar, even reproducing nations in context. I'm clearly here indebted to Michael Billig and his idea of banal nationalism, but the banal, I want to suggest, underpins the momentous here and is deployed in ways that are currently significant. So, shouldn't need to convince you. Nations do not exist naturally. The nations that we recognize in the world were put in place historically and are constantly reproduced. Every time we print a map, we reproduce a representation of the world. If this map has different colors and sharp lines between countries, this encourages a national understanding of the internal identity of the country, as well as its distinction from others. And this is available then to politics, obviously not without conflict. And in the current world, we have a variety of conflicts. Each of them reminds us that what is internal and what is external is far less settled than those conventional maps lead us to believe. And these are conflicts that become, in some part, international, but are rooted in at least some people's understandings of the national and the domestic, right? The Ukraine conflict classically pits the idea of an autonomous, sovereign country, Ukraine, against the idea of a greater Russia, in which that is simply an illegitimate separatist project. Okay, and there are versions of this all around. The formation of nations is always a matter of power, material and physical power, entwined with cultural struggles and force. To try to suggest one of these is simply the independent causal variable, the other derivative, misses the extent to which they are constantly entangled. The wars of religion in Europe were bloody wars of physical force. They were central to European state-making, as Charles Tilly argued, and yet that doesn't license us to say this is really all about the state and not about religion. It is both. Fichte's famous address to the German nation, pivotal to the history of German nationalism, is at once working in these different registers. The production of integrated languages, the resistance to losing those languages, the fear that is active now of losing language among the national conservatives, and of course, the interplay of religions are all key. I'm going to move quickly here. Right? Equally key is the building of national infrastructures, which has been going on throughout this period, which I think has been somewhat neglected by accounts of nationalism. That is to say, again, my recurrent theme, creating nation has been an important background to disputes over nationalism, and national understandings have been being reproduced in the organization of infrastructures. A simple example is try to go from one place to any distant other place on the continent of Europe, and notice how still, after years of the European Union, trains are organized in significant ways in national terms, and routes are problematic as you cross national boundaries. But consider also the extent to which news is still absorbed largely in national languages, and in which, this is a slide from China in the lower left, the building of national integrative infrastructure continues in some places. Note that China is able to do this, partly because of an authoritarian government, partly because of technology and resources. It seems the UK is not. The UK has been announcing high-speed rail for decades and finding itself unable to build it, and unable to build it in part not just because of the failures of successive governments, though I will say these are real, and I won't get any further involved in UK politics, but also because of the extent to which the common national understanding of the country is undermined by a variety of local challenges to the project. Now, I'm not sure whether high-speed rail is all that important, but the inability to build it, despite repeated suggestions, runs up against not just the issue of localities in between, but the way in which market capitalism is organized and itself in tension with national integration. So we have the standard maps again. Nation states look stable and settled. The hyphen between nation and state is doing lots of work, right? But this is in play, and it's much more explicitly in play now than it has been for a pretty long time. Donald Trump's surprising declarations that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States, and that the US should, at the very least, assume a protectorate over Greenland, if not absorb it, are a case in point. Donald Trump is a climate denier for most of his history. One of the signature features of the Trump administration is to cut back all government support for renewable energy sources and to double down on fossil fuel sources. Nonetheless, Donald Trump may seem to believe in global warming enough to think that there are going to be North Sea routes that are clearly of interest to Russia across its northern coast, an issue for China as it relates to the world, and a potential security threat to the United States if it isn't controlling the Arctic. Now, there are a variety of ways in which we can see this, but there is a fairly serious project of geopolitical reorganization that is behind these seemingly frivolous claims. I must say one of the most remarkably frivolous bits of the Trump rhetoric around this was the idea that Canada, much larger than the United States, would become one American state. But the question here of expansion of territory is an old imperial question, but also an old national question. And just how this might be organized has brought geopolitics back into the forefront of thinking. There was relatively little, not zero, but relatively little reference to geopolitics in most of the global contests and most of the debates about nationalism a generation ago. It's very central and present now, including in the various big power conflicts that are going on. The Belt and Road Initiative from China is absolutely a project of geopolitical engagement. I will also emphasize it's a project that focuses on Eurasia, understood as running from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. It's a renewal of an old idea of the Eurasian continent that has been divided in various ways by the idea of East and West as Western Europeans constructed it, by the clash of empires that came to a head with World War I, and by the rise of Islam, which is described by some Russian and Hungarian and other current national conservatives or ethno-nationalists as a plot to divide West from East in Europe by putting Islam in between the two. Now, exactly who is masterminding this and how to think of it is a question, but it's lobbed as a charge against the United States, which is asserted by Russian nationalists to have been excessively friendly to Islam as a way of weakening Russia and weakening the solidarity that ought to link all of Eurasia. Right? So here we have climate change meeting commerce, meeting geopolitical ideas that go back to the late 19th century, right? With potential new sea routes and changes in how shipping might work, but also potential new security challenges that we see a bit more clearly if we look in the northern pole projection of a global map. So this is some of the context for the resurgence of nationalism. Trying to cut my slides, I took out one talking about all the other things that are also going on, and there are clearly lots of different challenges to nation states. But there is in the current world a determination to be strong at the national level, linked to a loss of confidence in diplomacy and in the so-called international community. And I think there's good reason to not have great confidence in the international community on many issues, to a sense that capitalist-led globalization didn't work for countries as it was supposed to work, and in fact undermined them. And in this context, there is then a lot of elaboration of claims to particularity, of asserting our language, religion, customs, myths against universalism, of suggesting that universalism is itself a kind of Enlightenment ideology that should be rejected. So we have here an explicit rejection of Enlightenment by many of the national conservatives, and very closely linked to liberalism as a projection of that secular Enlightenment ideology to be challenged. I've just mentioned that there are a number of these, and you may or may not be familiar with them, and I won't spend a lot of time on them because I'm running out of time, but let me just evoke some of the so-called national conservatives for you. This guy who may not be very well known in Europe and isn't extremely well known in America is extremely effective in America. I could have spoken to a sociological audience 2 years ago and found no one who had Now people are a bit more aware because of the second Trump administration. He is the man who weaponized critical race theory during and in the pandemic and in relation to the Black Lives Matter protest, alleging this was a plot to take over public education and denigrate the status, turn white children into self-hating whites by extolling the virtues of blacks. He has been instrumental to challenging LGBTQ policies in schools, suggesting gay teachers were trying to convert the children, and linked to a wider panic over childhood. He is the person who made the acronym DEI famous and toxic as and part of a larger anti-woke movement, rather than three separate words, values that various liberals endorse: diversity, equity, inclusion. This became the idea of a toxic imposition. This is supported. His policies are being enacted by the Trump administration, which is, among other things, extracting massive cutbacks from American universities, blocking federal funds, demanding that admissions policies and other policies be changed, and that it assume direct oversight of these. Now, it's not all down to just Chris Rufo, but a lot of it comes. I will add an interesting thing about Chris Rufo. He says his primary theoretical inspiration is Herbert Marcuse. That is, he is one of a number of figures on the right. There are many in Europe for whom it's Gramsci, not Marcuse, who is the figure, who are trying to take what they see as the playbook of the left and turn it to the right. Charlie Kirk, recently assassinated, is another and a key white Christian nationalist figure. And I won't go into any more details. I'm just trying to evoke this. Here we get another couple that you may not know about in this. Curtis Yarvin, a key thinker for Silicon Valley, big influence on Peter Thiel, on J.D. Vance, and Steve Bannon, a variety of others, and somebody who has explicitly said the errors of the Enlightenment, including elite universities, but also certain kinds of corporations, elite big law firms, and conventional religion, must be countered by a dark Enlightenment, and is one of many of these national conservatives explicitly relating to monarchy as a possible solution. The Bronze Age pervert, who wants you to note his bodybuilding and not his face in all of this, promoting a Bronze Age lifestyle, links the masculinity movement into nationalism, and again, with large-scale effect. When I say link to Peter Thiel, I think Peter's the next slide, this is not to nobody. This is to a very successful and rich entrepreneur, to the head of the largest contractor with the U.S. Defense Department, to the in fact, almost only really major contractor for surveillance that is not an Israeli firm. So Palantir is an enormously influential firm in the world of state security, politics, and investment. And note here that this is not, as common accounts of the MAGA movement and Donald Trump's followers suggest, the great unwashed, the uneducated, the people left behind, that we are talking people who are very centrally engaged in elite university and corporate worlds, but with ideas that most have chosen to ignore for a long time. Behind this are a variety of think tanks. The Claremont Institute is one, and one devoted to followers of Leo Strauss as a political theorist of considerable note and genuine significance, who might indeed not be supportive of all done in his name, but is a patron saint to a large part of the national conservative movement. Now, again, I won't take the time to go on in this. There's a division in the US between East Coast and West Coast Straussians as a division in conservative politics, and there is not a united front of conservative politics. There are a lot of others, a lot of diverse currents, but this is gaining success and foothold in the Trump administration, and we need to think about that. I won't go into the divided right. This issues in a post-liberal movement, this is where I'm going to have to stop because we're running out of time, which links a variety of academics with respectable positions and books with major university presses, the Israeli Yoram Hazony, the American Patrick Deneen, to a number of political figures who have to be understood as having serious intellectual engagements and profiles. You don't have to agree with them, but it's important to their brand. It's important to who they are as political figures that they are not just populist rabble-rousers. They are serious intellectuals who are also populist rabble-rousers. Rod Dreyer is particularly interesting. I don't know if any of you encountered him while he was in Britain for the National Conservative Conference last year. An American convert to Eastern Orthodoxy who lives in Hungary, is very close to the Orban regime, and a key broker of relations between Europe and America. The author of The Benedict Option, suggesting the liberal world has become so broken, conservatives need to establish separate communities to just exist into it, but also an important part of as is J.D. Vance, of a religious right that is significant. That's most Catholic, but also Orthodox. Right? So we have the conventional political populists out there, but we also have real and serious intellectual movements behind them. And that is indeed the focus of my current research. So I'm going to end the presentation because of the lack of time and just say we need to be thinking not just about these characters in the political foreground, but about the serious nationalist intellectuals in the background. Thanks. Oh, different pictures.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. So many interesting themes that you touched upon. So I'm pretty sure there will be loads of questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or put your question into the chat so I can read it out loud. So with that being said, please, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Starting off with Marco.
Yes, correct. Thank you very much. I was just reflecting on the fact that I'm sure maybe you're aware that here in the UK, the Labour Party, but not necessarily the Labour Party, I would say the left is trying to come up with the idea of a nation which is progressive, which is inclusive. And I was thinking about when actually the nation is mobilized by the political right, it seems there is more quotation mark true. It seems it's more appealing to the people. And whereas the nation is mobilized by the left, it seems that it's not as successful. And I wonder whether you want to reflect on that in order to understand whether there is something about the nation that actually makes the nation more difficult to be embraced by the left. Obviously, we know about the whole history of the internationalism on the left, but I wonder whether there is something more substantive that has to do with the nation that makes the nation easier to be mobilized and embraced, both by political actors, but also the followers, the people, when it comes from the right. Obviously, you present all the national conservatives, but again, reflecting on the difficulties that the left in UK, but also in other parts of Europe, has when it tries to mobilize the nation in a more inclusive and progressive way. Thank you.
So, good question. I think you're absolutely right now, Marco, that the left is finding this very difficult and the right is finding the alignment easy to achieve. I think the question is, did that have to be the case? And what's the history behind it? And I would say that the short version of saying this is the left is coming to this much too late. And ignoring the issues that are being taken up by the new right, which is not to say the left should have been taking them up in the same way, for a long time, has created this easy alignment for the right. But there is nothing inherently not left, right? So the extent to which redistributive policies economically were adopted in European welfare states in large part depended on fairly strong national identity mobilized by left parties, including Labour in Britain, encouraged by coming in the wake of World War II, which had produced a stronger sense of national solidarity, so that the capacity to get through policies that said you should pay taxes to help those people depended on being a part of this common nation. So I think that there's no reason to think the left can't do it. That said, the left hasn't done it. The left has been more internationalist, more committed to cosmopolitanism. I've previously argued some of this is an elective affinity of elites for their fellow international elites. I think what's interesting right now in the national conservatism is partly the extent to which the conservatives are, in one sense, internationalist and internationally linked and producing a new global elite. And as the left in most countries founders, is finding it hard to be either internationalist or nationalist. So we have a real crisis of the left here around this issue, but I don't think it's because of an inherent impossibility of the left. I would add also that I don't think being serious about national integration and solidarity means necessarily being a bellicose nationalism. The point isn't just that the left should have been doing what the right now does, and be repressive of difference internally or be contentious externally, but rather the left should have realized an issue was brewing, which it kept saying was not really an issue. I'll close by my sense of a UK experience, probably more true to my experience a decade ago than now, but I think still pretty true, which is there is a kind of left that says London is working great. We have great international restaurants. We have financial, that worries about the status of the city as a financial center and what will happen to the country if it declines, much more than it worries about the rest of Britain. This kind of division is very problematic for the left, I think.
Yes, thank you, Craig. Joanna, I see there are two questions in there. I wonder whether you want, if Craig is happy, maybe to collect the two, and so we can save some time.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, let's do that then. So I'll read the question out loud that's in the chat, which is a question from Atsuko. He's asking, going back to the framing discussion part of your presentation, isn't the agency of state in forming a nation somewhat underplayed in your presentation, in particular in the discussion of infrastructure and the formation/creation of nations? Usually the entity that has resources that can pursue national infrastructure development is the state. So that's the first question. Then I see a hand from Eric. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your interesting overview of conservative nationalism. I'm not totally sure whether you're speaking about their type of nationalism, but you seem to identify nationalism and the nation very much with an ethnic or cultural community. And I think the nation can also be defined as a demos. And so not so much as a cultural community, but as a community of citizens. And in this sense, I would argue that the left can also be defined as nationalist, because they defend the rights of the citizens, regardless of their ethnic or cultural background. So I would even argue that national cultures are the consequence of nation states and nation building. They're not the cause or pre-existing, but they are largely created by the efforts of dedicated nationalists. So I'm not totally sure how you view this.
Okay, thanks. Good questions. I think I must have been unclear on one. So I think there is a lot
Craig,
of...
sorry to interrupt you, because I'm conscious there are 4 more questions in the chat.
Okay,
Are you
take
happy?
them all.
Are you happy?
Collect them all.
Not sure whether whole, but can you take maybe another one so we
Sure,
do
fine.
2 rounds, 3 of 3?
Sure.
Yeah, I think Tariq was first. I saw that Tariq left and then he rejoined, but Tariq was first, and then I guess Sinisha and Nira. Yeah, thank you, Tariq. Hi, Tariq.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Marco, for noticing that. I was having some kind of a technical problem. Thank you. And thank you, Craig. That was, as usual, very interesting. And my question, in some ways, actually also relates to Marco's, but perhaps different as well. And that is, You said rightly that at the moment we're seeing this very powerful trend in so many parts of the world of a right-wing populist nationalism, but nationalism isn't necessarily right-wing and nationalism isn't necessarily populist. So I just wonder what thoughts you have about a kind of nationalist stream that seemed to be becoming prominent in the 1990s and early 2000s, and perhaps earlier too, but which seems to have kind of disappeared. Perhaps it's been eclipsed by the political forces you've been talking about. A more of a kind of center-right or progressive nationalism, which in one grouping is associated with secession, so like Quebec, Scotland, or Catalonia, where there is a strong idea of peoplehood, but not exclusion, or put it another way, not an internal division, as there is in right-wing nationalists between the people and, say, migrants. The exclusion is we want to exclude ourselves from the bigger state organization that we're part of, which is not a people. That was one kind of argument. And another kind of argument, less prominent, but one which did get going in the 1990s and early 2000s, is an idea that, oh, we do want to be part of the larger nation, the fuller nation, but it needs to be rethought and remade to account for a pluralism which it currently is ignoring or denying, a certain kind of multicultural nationalism, which to some extent, not always perhaps as loudly as some of us would have liked, but which to some extent was voiced by early New Labour and found some expression in what in Britain is known, or internationally is known, as the Parekh report. So these alternative nationalisms, have they disappeared for good, as it were, because of the forces at play at the moment? Are they possibly going to make a comeback? Just some thoughts about those kinds of nationalisms.
All right, we'll have a second round later. Maybe is it an idea to answer these questions first?
Okay, fine. So first, I think there is a lot of impact of states. Some of that impact might be through agency and things that are consciously chosen as state policy. Much of it is through simply the pursuit of other projects by means of states. And so whether it should be called agency, I'm not clear, but certainly states have a big impact. In relation to Eric's account, I have a sort of yes and no answer. I think it's extremely important that we think about the demos of citizens and how it is constructed and created. Whether we can just say the demos of citizens is a nation strikes me as problematic. And my general view is that notions like constitutional patriotism tell us something important about how states work and the state's need for loyalty among citizens and the idea of that, and tell us very little about the kind of solidarity on which nation states depend. That there's just no evidence of something like constitutional patriotism actually producing solidarity sufficient to underpin democracy, its major goal, let alone sufficient for other purposes. So I'm not saying nationalism has to be ethnic. I'm saying that there is a need for strong solidarity in order to operate democracy at large scale, and therefore we should be attending to how that democracy gets produced. Producing it in mono-ethnic terms seems to me very problematic. This then raises Tarek's question. How do you not do it? How do you get strong solidarity, but not get it in mono-ethnic terms? And I think, this is a key. I don't think we know the answer as clearly as we could. So the various 1990s examples Tarek raised are all deserving of attention. They're sort of problematic. So take Quebec, where there is a Quebec versus Canada struggle that gets resolved with Quebec staying in Canada, and a brief surge of remaking street signs and public discourse. It was never simply Quebec nationalism without also being inflected by class and infected by broader issues about the economy. But yes, we need to learn from this. How progressive was the Parti Québécois? Well, on some issues better than others, not enough. I'll give you I'm not a Canadian, but my political opinion in a moment. It immediately gave way to a very hostile regime for immigrants. So that the successors to the Parti Québécois in the era of the struggle for national independence enact a variety of very anti-immigrant laws. They're in Canada, but now they're facing Asian and other immigrants and face a challenge, so that you get the Taylor-Bouchard inquiry and a variety of other kinds of challenges. That's overlaid on, not to go too far in Quebec, a Montreal versus the rest story. And so not unlike the London versus the rest of the UK story, the position of the richest and most developed city in Quebec in relation to the rest of the country becomes pivotal. It's seen from a distance as full of immigrants, not entirely loyal to us. The immigrants are seen as choosing English as their language rather than French. And the bottom line here is, yes, we should be studying this. Yes, it is important. In this context, a variety of political thinkers articulate very important ideas about multicultural democracy, which I think we haven't followed up enough, and are key. My co-author Charles Taylor among them, though there are differences of opinion among these multiculturalists. The question that you raised with regard to the Aparak report now is sort of, what are the terms of inclusion? It's one thing to say we should be inclusive, and that there should be some sort of recognition of difference in multiculturalism. It's another thing to work out really what are the terms. And I gestured to that by saying I think a mistake in this context was to be strongly suspicious of assimilationist politics, to see this as simply the imposition of minority culture. And I think that ended up being destabilizing for the multicultural project, which would have fared better if it had not been connected to that kind of cultural idea that all assimilation needed to be resisted. The bottom line to this, I'll go back to Canada, but just to your report, is I think that there was no liberal solution to this. There could have been a left solution, and the left failed. Now, I'm making a distinction. I can't take the time to elaborate between left and liberal. But I think that in the case of Canada, something like the new Democratic Party in Quebec had different ideas about what kind of restructuring would make it viable for Quebec to be multicultural, but also a support for a Francophone majority in Quebec that was a minority in Canada, and that this would have taken a real restructuring of the society, not merely some liberal legal changes, street signs and things like that. And this wasn't achieved. And that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is not having a left argument for what kind of political, economic, and cultural transformation would do this, and just wanting to say, okay, now we're going to have multiculturalism without changing anything else, right? And I think this goes for Asians in Britain and for a variety of other cases, that's part of the problem. I'll stop there.
All right. Looking at the time, I see there are 3 hands raised, so we'll ask the people to keep the question as short as possible, so we can try to get an answer to the last 3 questions. So the first hand that I see raised is from Sinisa. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Craig. This is a great project. I look forward to reading this. Just a sort of what's interesting to me is the kind of the global resonance of the national conservatives, both on the elite level and on the everyday level. I'm thinking particularly like the assassination of Charlie Kirk, how it resonated in places that you would never think that they had any idea who this person is. So that's something that seems to me new to me. And also these mutual influences. You've made some links between these kind of American ideologues and Orban and others, and Dugin, and there are these thinkers around there who work together easily. And conservatives had these links before, in 20th century, 19th century, but now it seems to be kind of a mass phenomenon. This is not something that we've seen before. So what would you say about that? Yeah.
All right, thank you. The second hand raise is from Nira. Nira, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, Craig. It's been a long time. I was very glad that you mentioned the national infrastructure, because I think part of the reason that the left has, of course, failed in relation to nationalism is because the national cake has shrunk so drastically. So it's much easier for the right to benefit from such a situation. And of course, it raises all kinds of issues. But what I wanted, though, to point out, and that relates to what you talked about, assimilationism, that the whole notion of ethnicity and nationalism, the relationship has changed via the new right. And I think the term autochthony or nativism is more suitable than ethnicity, because this is the situation now that a Black woman can be the head of a very racist conservative party, and yet nobody actually talks about the fact that she's Black. That relates to a certain kind of assimilationism of a politics of belonging, that the wall is very important because it differentiates between those who belong and those who do not. And I would like your comment on that.
Yeah.
All right, and then the last question from Caesar. I see another hand raised from Umut, but I'm afraid that because of the time,
Johanna, I think we can. Sorry to interrupt you. I think we can also take Umut, and then we take.
Okay.
We take.
All right. Let's go with Caesar first then.
Yes, thank you very much. My question is inspired by partly the work of Michael Billig that is here. I wonder, I mean, we are discussing this because at least some of us are very concerned about the current moment. So I wonder if, in your view, the way forward or the answer should be through alternative, progressive, whatever we want to call it, nationalisms, or we should free our political imaginations from nationalism and perhaps think of other ways, other responses that go beyond or go outside the idea of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question for Umut. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Craig. Nice to see you again. I'll be very quick because I know we have a time. Didn't we also, as scholars of nationalism, fail? Because, I mean, I can see very clear lines that can be drawn between primordialism, ethno-symbolism, and national conservatism or extreme Zionism, etc. Whereas the modernist account, of which I'm, of course, a part, I'm not included you into this because you said nations matter, whereas I didn't. I never did until recently. We just basically, said that nations are invented, imagined, etc., etc. Of course, we became more nuanced later on, but we never offered a real alternative either. And I'm saying, this as a kind of self-reflection, self-critique, to which I include myself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all of you. And as I respond to each individual, I'm also going to reshare slides just to be able to show one thing, I hope. Well, maybe not. Anyway, I think a core issue here is raised by each of these questions. So I want to underscore what I think that core issue is and how we should understand it. Frustrating. Okay, I'm not going to be able to get back to my slides. I'm not quite sure why, and I won't take the time to do it. Wait, there we go. All right. So can you see my screen now? I hope you can see my screen. I hope you can hear me too.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. And I won't turn into the whole big presentation. So I wanted to go first to Sneesa's comment. Yes, the global resonance of national conservative thinking. It is a very global movement, and it's very strong across nations in Europe, but it extends, obviously, the US, has some Latin American connections, has more Asian connections. You can go into the question, does Modi fit the national conservative model? He has increasingly built ties that suggest he may think that way. Certainly Netanyahu has fairly openly embraced and been embraced by the national conservatives from Israel. So it's unclear. This is tied up for many of them with an idea of Western civilization and a crisis. Lots of theories of decline are prominent, and there's a bit, what's the golden age? Well, that varies. Is it the 1950s? Is it, the Middle Ages? There's variation. This has been strikingly popular and built. So I think, to Umut's point, we as scholars of nationalism haven't done as good a job as we might, partly because we've been focused on our own internal ideas of what are the things to debate in tracking the emergence of this new nationalism and understanding what's going on. These are international ties that have been being built for years among these kind of people. They are built in culture as well as in politics. So someone like Alexander Dugin mentioning this, the people who build on the legacy of Julius Evola, American figures like Steve Bannon, the role of a certain kind of heavy metal rock music, especially Scandinavian, linked to all of these. This is significant, right? And this has been being built for 30 years. This didn't come about 3 years ago, when it finally began to get attention from the mainstream. So absolutely, we need to understand how that's been produced. Steve Bannon has been in direct touch with Alexander Dugin. They both have connections to the rock music world. Steve Bannon, among other things, made music videos before president, right? They are part of a cultural, political, social formation that's key. This then is significant in relation to Caesar's question. I think it's absolutely crucial that we think about alternatives to this kind of nationalism. I don't think it's obvious that we should think in terms of simply alternatives to nation rather at this moment, rather than what kind of both and would allow us to have a politics that is not limited to the most reductive and problematic notions of nation, but would go beyond that, but would indeed recognize the things that are making nation such a salient form of organization. I could put that another way. I mentioned some people associated with post-liberalism, which is another label that is currently active. And I think there hasn't been enough attention to what would make a good post-liberalism in terms of some of the values held by people on the left and liberals. That is, we have more or less ceded faith, flag, family, and even the question of what could come after liberalism to a version of a nationalist right wing. And that's very problematic because there are real problems with what has been wrought by centrist liberalism in most of the world's wealthier countries. And there needs to be a critical engagement with that liberalism, call it a good post-liberalism rather than a pernicious post-liberalism. And we're failing. This takes me to Neera in this, who's absolutely right. I don't always use the language of ethnicity in my work. I use it here because the literature on nationalism has been so caught in this state versus ethnic kind of duality, and modernist versus ethno-symbolist and all this. And what I want to argue is what we need to do is not switch sides in this, but figure out how to have a both and understanding of nation all the way through, I tried to say. So I think our literature lots of wonderful work got undermined a bit by the extent to which we kept having an argument between these two sides, clarifying that argument so our students could understand it better, rather than working out how to have more of a both-and understanding of the idea that different things were going on together in producing the modern world. So Nir is absolutely right. The idea of a simple ethnic nation is challenged by recognition of leader figures into the movement who are from the groups that have been stigmatized and excluded. And there is more than a little of this, or the issue of gender, the extent to which we have women leaders of movements that are associated with gender politics that surprise us, but nonetheless are important in all of this. I think that what this calls for is an examination of what Nira and I agree on this, called the politics of belonging. I think belonging is really important, that the national conservatives, the right-wing nationalists, thrive in part because of a great desire for belonging that has been at odds with liberal individualism. And too many have constructed the understanding of the demos and democracy in completely liberal individualist terms, and not taken seriously the issue of belonging and the way in which it becomes a politics, which it is for migrants as well as for the countries into which they assimilate. My last comment, and the reason I wanted to get these pictures up, aside from just wanting you to get Dugin and Bannon and Evola in mind, is the extent to which my core theme, movement intellectuals have set the stage. I go back to Umut's framing of it. Did we fail? Well, yes, in a certain way. We failed to study the most significant transformation in thinkings about nationalism that has been going on in a long time enough. As I've begun to work on this, I keep surprising myself by how thinking that I was around and that I was a conscious observer, how much I failed to observe. How many people I hadn't taken seriously. Oh, I knew Julius Evola existed, but that wasn't serious for me. Well, it's actually very seriously taken up by part of the French New Right, which is actually influential in a variety of other contexts and so forth. And here, not just the students of nationalism, but social science. So let me put this, you put it in a way that is self-critical of us students of nationalism. We've failed. Let me put it in another way. Mainstream social science failed to take us seriously at the same time. And nationalism really was important, and nations really were important. And we may not have produced the right understanding, and we have more work to do, but this needs to be on the agenda. And in social science, we have something equivalent to what we have in politics. In politics, we have versions of the left and liberals scrambling to try to take seriously something they have ignored and blocked, and often deciding that the left politics should be like the right politics, and they should just move to the right a little bit. I think that's not a very viable solution or intellectually serious. And the same thing for social science. It's not just, oh, well, let's add a different variable to our large-scale quantitative analysis. It involves a rethinking of categories that needs to happen. I like quoting Andrew Breitbart, who was the person who gave Steve Bannon a job at Breitbart News, died young, key thinker in this, who said politics is downstream from culture. And he got this idea, he says, from Gramsci and Marcuse. This is a key figure in the emergence of a right-wing media sphere. So how did this become a global organization? Well, partly through far more effective use of new media affordances than the left ever produced during the last 30 years. These movement intellectuals who appropriate an idea of a Gramscian struggle, which is not always the immediate struggle of the clash over the point of politics, but is often a preparatory struggle over culture and ideas, is something that is surprisingly lost to left liberal politics, which gives up on securing the common ideas that could underpin the desired politics, but it's very much central to the right politics, which becomes a politics of culture and, as Neera said, a politics of belonging in ways that are really crucial. And that happens in an always already international set of connections. Dugin is connecting to the French New Right, for example. Steve Bannon is connecting to those Scandinavian musicians, and so forth and so on. And Hungary, which is interesting in many ways, under Orban, manages to position itself, if he stays in power and wins the election, as a sort of host country for conventions, conferences, and get-togethers among these. But there are a number, so I'll stop, but just urge us all to pay more attention. This is happening in publications. It's happening on videos. It's not secret, but it has been outside our frame of reference.
Thank you so much. This is a lot of food for thought, I would say. Thank you so much, Professor Calhoun, for giving us this talk and sharing all these interesting insights. So with that being said, we're a bit over time, so I'd like to close the seminar. Thank you so much again for giving this talk, and thank you so much to everybody for coming up and for showing up and participating. Like Marco said in the beginning, this talk is recorded, so if you would like to rewatch the talk, that will be possible, and the video will be uploaded to the website. So please take a look at that, and then we're looking forward to seeing you at the next seminar. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.